Hi, everyone. This is the second part of our PowerPoint series looking at how the United States becomes involved in the war. A couple quick things I want to say about what happens in mid to late 1941 with regard to the war in Europe and America's role there. And then we're going to look at events that happen in Asia and the Pacific, culminating with the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, which is what actually brings the United States directly into the war. Tensions continued to increase in the Atlantic Ocean into the year 1941. So this is after passage of the Lend-Lease Act. And in September 1941, an American destroyer, the USS Greer, exchanged fire with a German submarine, and this was after Roosevelt had authorized American ships to report the position of spotted German submarines to the British Navy. Roosevelt gave, as I note in the slide, a highly distorted account of this attack to the American public. The Greer had been carrying mail to U.S. troops stationed in Greenland. Roosevelt emphasized that, and that was true, but he left out the details of it engaging in reporting the position of German submarines, which is what led to this confrontation with a particular German U-boat. And then in December 1941, just before the attack on Pearl Harbor, a German submarine torpedoed and sank another American destroyer, the Reuben James, resulting in the deaths of over 100 American sailors. The great folk singer Woody Guthrie even composed a song about it. And this is what prompted Franklin Roosevelt to issue what he termed a shoot-on-sight order, authorizing American naval vessels to engage with and attack German submarines beyond reporting their positions. So, in a way, the United States was in this kind of undeclared naval war with Nazi Germany even before we became directly involved in the Second World War. But it's events in Asia and the Pacific that draw the United States directly into the conflict. Eric Foner covers this, and I mentioned in the Zoom session that American-Japanese relations had been deteriorating really since the 1920s. This started to an extent with the restrictive immigration legislation that the United States passed that we talked about when we covered the 1920s, which practically cut off immigration from Japan, and the Japanese regarded this as what it was, which I described it in class as a racist piece of legislation that set up these race-based quotas that favored immigration by white Caucasian people and discouraged, and in some cases cut off immigration entirely from non-white nations. And as Japan became more expansionist and the Japanese military began to exercise more control over foreign policy, this caused a deterioration in the relationship too. It was in 1931 that Japan invades and conquers this area of northeast China that you see, a province, Manchuria, that was rich in a variety of natural resources that Japan wanted. Japan conquered this, renamed it Manchukuo, and that was the beginning of a series of the next several years, through the 1930s, of attacks and expansion by Japan along the eastern coast of China. China was too big for Japan to conquer entirely, but China was politically divided, weak during this period, and it made China susceptible to these Japanese incursions, attacks, and conquests. I showed this photograph in our Zoom session. This appeared in Life magazine, which was the most widely read and arguably the most influential magazine publication in the United States during this era. And it was republished in many newspapers across the country as well, showing the aftermath of a Japanese air raid on the Chinese city of Shanghai in 1937. This abandoned infant, bloody, wounded, squalling amidst the wreckage. And this photograph solidified a growing hostility toward Japan felt by much of the American public, much more visceral anger than Americans felt about Nazi Germany during this time period. Japan's decision to align itself with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy further alienated the American public. You see the ceremony here signing the Tripartite Pact between Germany, Italy, and Japan in 1940. Not a direct military alliance, but a statement of cooperation in which these nations pledged to defend one another if one was attacked by an outside power. It's one of the oddities of history that Adolf Hitler, who never kept his word about anything and lied constantly, did adhere to this, and this was the justification of his decision after Japan attacked the United States to enter the war. So this step and subsequent aggressive actions by Japan toward Southeast Asia, particularly the area we now know as Vietnam, which in 1940 and 41 was controlled by the French, resulted in Roosevelt taking an increasingly hard line with the Japanese and implementing an embargo against Japan in 1941. This was a serious step because the United States at this time was the primary source of oil, aviation fuel, scrap metal, steel, coal to Japan. There were all sorts of exports the United States sent to Japan. All of these were cut off, with oil being regarded as the most critical by the Japanese government. So this coincides with Japan's military really gaining complete control over the Japanese government, with a General Tojo, one of Japan's top army commanders, becoming Prime Minister of Japan in 1941. And from that point on, the military is really calling the shots for Japan's foreign policy. Japan's military began making plans to move into areas of Southeast Asia to gain access to oil. With the cutoff of oil shipments from the American embargo, Japan had oil reserves for about a year, and so getting access to an oil supply was critically important. And the area Japan wants to conquer to get that included what's now Indonesia, but at the time was a Dutch colony known by Americans as the Dutch East Indies, also the Netherlands East Indies, as you see here on the map. You can see the area that was controlled by France. So remember that Germany had conquered both Holland and France, so these colonial governments were isolated and vulnerable, and this is where Japan decides to strike. Japanese military leaders were somewhat concerned about the presence of American naval and air bases in the Philippine Islands. The Philippines were controlled by the United States in this period. And so the Japanese military develops this bold, risky plan to eliminate the American threat, only it expands beyond attacking American forces in the Philippines to embrace the idea of attacking the American Pacific Fleet at its main base at Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands. And I mentioned in our Zoom session, it's ironic that the person tasked with developing this attack, planning it strategically, Admiral Yamamoto, was one of the few people in Japan's military who knew much about the United States. He had been a college student here, had attended Harvard, spoke fluent English, had worked on the staff of the Japanese embassy in Washington, D.C. He had traveled pretty widely in the United States, and he realized that industrially and militarily, Japan was no match for the United States. So he thought this was an unwise idea and voiced opposition to it. But once it was adopted by the military and the government, he went about dutifully planning an attack on Pearl Harbor. So he showed this slide in class too, an aerial view of Pearl Harbor as it looked in October 1941. The American Pacific Fleet had moved here just a few years earlier, previously having been based in San Diego. And it was controversial, and I asked the class to look at the geography of this, and one of you correctly pointed out that one of the risks is that there's just one narrow channel going in and out of Pearl Harbor. That was one of the reasons some naval commanders didn't think it was a good location to stage the fleet. Those who favored it argued that because the water was shallow in Pearl Harbor, that would help protect the ships stationed there, arguing that the water was too shallow for airplanes equipped with aerial torpedoes to launch them and attack ships. This turned out to be false, as the Japanese modified their torpedoes to run at a shallower depth and had their pilots run hundreds of hours of practice runs so they could master coming in at just the right angle to carry this out successfully. So here's a map showing these two parts of Japan's fleet forming two carrier strike forces sail across the Pacific undetected and approach the Hawaiian Islands from the north. And this was deliberate. There was an awareness on the part of the United States, because we had broken Japan's military code. There were indications that an attack by Japan somewhere in the Pacific was probably likely, but the expectation was that would be in the Philippines. So there was a heightened alert at Pearl Harbor, but on the American side, as I mentioned in class, there were a number of mistakes. We didn't patrol 360 degrees around the Hawaiian Islands with airplanes. We were only patrolling the western approaches. So there's this faulty assumption that if the Japanese did attack, even though that wasn't expected, that they would conveniently sail in straight from the west. And of course, they didn't do that. They approached from the north. This was part of Yamamoto's plan. Also critically important to him was the idea of striking early on a Sunday morning, when he thought Americans would be the least prepared, and he was correct in that regard too. So the attack on Pearl Harbor was absolutely devastating. 3,000 Americans killed and wounded, hundreds of planes damaged and destroyed, most of the Pacific Fleet destroyed or sunk. It was a calamitous outcome. In fact, the details were so bad that the U.S. government withheld the full extent of the damage for over a year from the American public. Americans realized this was serious, but the full scope of it didn't come out until quite some time later. And so in response to this, Roosevelt delivers a famous speech to Congress, calling it a day that would live in infamy, and requesting a declaration of war against Japan, which he overwhelmingly received. Militarily, as I mentioned, the attack did considerable damage. Could have been much worse had Japan followed through with the second assault wave that the Japanese commander on the scene decided not to carry out. So it was successful, but in the long run, disastrous for Japan. As I mentioned in class, this united the American public in a way probably that nothing else could have. It infuriated Americans who were united in the view of fighting and defeating Japan. I think Roosevelt would have had a hard time getting the declaration of war against Germany for quite some time, but Hitler let him off the hook by making the mistake of declaring war on the United States 4 days later, So by December 11th, the United States is a full participant in the Second World War.